Procrastination is often misunderstood as laziness, but it rarely is. What people experience is not a lack of willpower, but a deep and persistent sense of mental heaviness. A task that looks simple on paper can feel almost impossible to begin, not because of its difficulty, but because of the emotional weight that has quietly attached itself to it. Over time, the brain does not respond to tasks themselves, it responds to what those tasks represent, psychologically and emotionally. Psychologists Timothy Pichul explains that procrastination is fundamentally an emotion regulation problem, not a time management one. People do not delay because they do not know what to do. They delay because they do not want to feel a certain way. When the brain predicts emotions like frustration, boredom, anxiety, uncertainty, self-doubt, or the fear of being judged, it activates avoidance. As a form of short-term emotional relief, this relief feels real, immediate, and calming, while the reward of completing the task feels distant, abstract, and uncertain. Daniel Kahneman's research on decision making shows that the brain consistently prioritizes present comfort over future benefit, a process known as temporal discounting. The discomfort of starting feels real now, while the benefit of finishing exists only in the future. So avoidance feels like the safer and more rational option, even when it creates long-term stress, regret, and negative consequences. Tasks become especially heavy when they carry personal meaning. A simple assignment can turn into a test of intelligence. A work project becomes a measure of self-worth. A message becomes a risk of rejection, and a decision feels like a threat to identity. The more emotionally charged a task becomes, the more the brain interprets it as dangerous. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux demonstrated that emotional responses can bypass conscious reasoning entirely, meaning the body reacts with stress, tension, shutdown, or avoidance before logic has time to step in. This explains why people often know exactly what they should do, yet still feel unable to start, because awareness comes after the reaction, not before delaying. A task provides temporary relief, but that relief is fragile and short lived. It quickly gives way to guilt, and guilt adds another emotional layer over time. Guilt turns into shame, and research by Brené Brown shows that shame does not motivate action. It shuts it down and pushes people toward withdrawal and disconnection. Pressure, harsh self-criticism, and telling yourself to just be disciplined only increase the sense of threat, making procrastination stronger rather than weaker. Susan David's work on emotional agility suggests that emotions must be acknowledged, rather than ignored, suppressed, or judged. When discomfort is pushed away or denied, the brain amplifies it, and avoidance becomes more intense. Procrastination in this sense is not a character flaw or a personality defect, but a learned emotional coping strategy. The brain believes it is protecting you from psychological harm, even if that protection becomes harmful in the long run. Albert Bandura's concept of self-efficacy helps explain why small steps are so powerful when a task feels manageable. Emotionally safe and non-threatening, the brain allows movement-breaking tasks. The smaller parts works not because it tricks productivity, but because it lowers perceived threat, reduces its identity risk, and changes the emotional prediction. The brain no longer sees the task as a judgment of worth, but as something survivable, controllable, and temporary. The longer a task is postponed, the heavier it becomes. Missed deadlines, broken promises to yourself, and accumulated stress add layers of emotional weight until the task feels overwhelming, even if it was simple at the beginning. At this stage, people often say, "I know it is easy, I just cannot do it." And that statement is accurate because the difficulty is no longer practical, it is emotional. Procrastination feels heavier than the task itself because the brain is carrying expectations, fears, memories, imagined outcomes, self-judgments, and future scenarios all at once. Each delay adds another layer to that weight, reinforcing the belief that starting will be painful, threatening, or exposing. Over time, the brain begins to associate the task itself with discomfort regardless of its actual difficulty, and this association becomes automatic and deeply ingrained. The nervous system learns that avoidance equals safety and starting equals danger, which means motivation alone cannot solve the problem, because motivation does not override its perceived threat. This is why sudden bursts of motivation often fail. They do not remove the emotional Wait, they only push against it briefly before exhaustion returns. Real change begins when the emotional load is reduced, when the task is reframed as neutral, when expectations are softened, when identity is separated from performance, when failure is no longer treated as a verdict on self-worth, and when progress is allowed to be imperfect, slow, and incomplete. When emotional weight is reduced, action becomes possible not through forced pressure or motivation, but through safety when starting. No longer feels like a threat to identity, competence, or self-respect. The brain stops resisting and movement begins naturally, often slowly, sometimes inconsistently, but more sustainably, not because you suddenly became disciplined or productive, but because your nervous system no longer felt the need to protect you from beginning.